Hi, in this video I wanted to talk about the argument of causation. Causal arguments actually come in two types. Think about it this way. You begin with some sort of central event or condition. An event is obviously something that happened. For instance, the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. That's an event. Or a condition, which is something which is ongoing. For instance, America's obesity problem. Something that is not a single day or a single instance of something. But either way, you can look at that central event or condition and you can go backwards in time. And you can say, why? Why did something happen? I like to call these the reasons. Or you could go forwards and say, well, what happened or what will happen? What happened as a result of the attacks of 9/11? Or what will happen because America has such an obesity problem? These I like to call the results. Reasons or results. It's important that you understand this right from the beginning, because when you write a causation essay, particularly one that's relatively short, as you are, you really want to focus in one direction only. Otherwise, your paper will be too superficial. So you could begin with the paper on, let's say, September 11th, the events of September 11th, and say, why did that happen? You're going to look at the reasons. This is what we call beginning with effect and going back to the causes. When you do so, you'll probably have multiple causes. Anything worth really writing about for our essays is probably not something super simple, right? It's going to have multiple causes. You could look at the rise of radical Islam. You could look at the United States military presence in the Middle East. You could look at cultural imperialism. There's lots of different things that you could look at and say, this is why this occurred. Same story on the other side. Multiple effects. Let's say you're doing the paper on obesity. You're not going to have one effect of a nation that is struggling with weight problems. You can talk about health issues, multiple health issues. Talk about financial issues. Talk about issues related to the environment. So on and so on. That would be a paper that begins with a cause and talk about effects. So when you are deciding on what kind of essay to write, not only do you need to decide on the subject, 9/11, obesity, etc., you also need to decide which direction you're headed in. Many topics can render a very good paper going in either direction. Some topics may be, shall we say, more interesting in one direction and maybe not so interesting in the other direction, and that will be for you to decide. Is it going to be exciting to talk about the causes of something, or is it going to be more exciting to talk about the effects of something? Now, as your textbook talks about on page 262, there are certain characteristics of causation essays. First of all, they're often part of other arguments, and especially the proposal argument, the policy paper. And that's, of course, the one that we finish our semester with, which is one of the reasons why we do it now. Okay? So, for instance, in the policy argument where you say a change needs to be made, we ought to pass a law, we need to change our practices, whatever it might be that you're arguing, oftentimes it's based on a cause or effect relationship. Okay? Almost all arguments of this nature are complex. If they're not complex, they're not worth writing about. If you want to say, why is America obese? For instance, you want to look at the causes of obesity in America. If all you say is fast food, that is an overly simplistic and reductive argument. There's a whole lot more going on. Okay, and you need to understand that. This is one of the, shall we call it, one of the problems with average minds. I'll put it that way. They tend to reduce cause and effect of complicated issues down to really simple issues. I won't point any fingers at national figures, but you can make your own conclusions. Speaking of conclusions, another common mistake is for people to think in absolutes. Typically, because these arguments are complex, they tend to yield probability, not absolutism. When you say it is likely to, right, you're being probable. This is going back to our argument about inductive and deductive logic, if you think about it. Most deductive arguments don't stand up if they're absolute arguments. On the other hand, if they're probable, then you're in much firmer ground. You say it's likely or it's not likely. So for example, just to use a topic that nobody's going to argue about because I won't let you, cigarette smoking is hazardous to your health. Okay, maybe they should have said it's probably hazardous to your health. Because we all have seen examples of people who smoked until their 80s or 90s. Does that mean smoking is a great idea? Probably not. Yes, there's always the exception. Oh, just use an absolute. So, keep that in mind. Now, they often rely on definitions. Okay, so for an easy example would be the argument about obesity. How do we define obesity? How do we find it as different from overweight? And do we need to maybe define morbidly obese? Right? These are arguments of definition, which should sound familiar because you've done an argument of definition paper. And one of the reasons we did an argument of definition before causation is for this precise reason. Causation arguments are often based on definitions. You want to talk about poverty, we got to define poverty. You want to talk about literacy, you got to define literacy, right? All these things come into play when you're putting together a proper causation argument. Now, one of the things I want to point out is how to develop or structure, let's put it this way, how to structure your argument. Now, the introduction doesn't change. We've used the same type of introduction all semester. Hook, introduce the subject, present your thesis. Then we need a concession. Now, when you say probably, right, this will probably happen or this is not probable to happen, that, I think, opens up the door pretty easily for your concession paragraph. What are the other things that are not probable or are probable compared to what your thesis is? In other words, where are those exceptions? Okay, talk about the 95-year-old man who still smokes a pack a day. Great. But there's your concession, right? Yes, there are some people who can smoke a great deal and never come down with lung cancer or any other related disease. Okay, then of course, rebuttal, blah, blah, blah. But the structure of the main body of your argument will basically follow the pattern of what are the causes, all right? So you have cause 1, cause 2, cause 3, cause 4, or whatever. Or what are the effects? Effect 1, effect 2, effect 3, effect 4, okay? So this is how you want to arrange your essay, and then of course you have your standard conclusion, in which you restate the thesis, answer the question, so what? Because you want to show that you're looking at the big picture, why this was important, why this matters, and a clincher to tie everything off with a nice little bow. Another word. The causation essay is very similar to the fact essay. In truth, in other textbooks, for example, the fact and causation essay are kind of considered the same thing. When you say a condition does exist, has existed, or will exist, that is a fact essay. Causation essay says basically why it exists or what's the result of it existing. I know, I sound like I'm splitting hairs at this point, right? But that's, our editors for Everything is an Argument have decided to separate those out into two separate types of papers. I consider both of these essays, the fact and the causation essay, to be pretty similar. They're both going to rely very heavily on having good quality sources, which is why we're back again with a minimum requirement for peer-reviewed materials, whether from a journal or a book, because quality of sources, while always important, becomes especially important in the argument of causation. Keep that in mind as you're writing your essay. Good luck.